There's an employment tribunal, going on in Scotland that really does encapsulate the clash of rights that can arise between women and trans women. Sandie Peggie is a female nurse. She objected to sharing a changing room with a trans doctor called Beth Upton. After an argument, it was in December 2023, Peggie, the nurse, was placed under investigation and suspended. She's taken the Fife Health Board and Dr Upton to an employment tribunal. Michael Foran is a lecturer in public law at the University of Glasgow. He's got a book coming out this year actually called Sex, Gender Identity and the Law, and he's been attending the tribunal since it started. Michael, thank you very much for joining us. Not everyone's been following this from the beginning. Just tell us, what were the incidents originally that started the whole thing?
Well, thanks very much for having me on. There are a set of incidents, but I think what initially starts this off is Dr. Upton begins to use the female changing room at NHS Fife. At that point, Sandie Peggie, a nurse there who feels uncomfortable and intimidated by Dr. Upton's presence, raises that with her manager. And nothing seems to have been done specifically to address that issue except to assure Sandie Peggie that Dr. Upton has a right to be in that space. And that then culminates eventually in a confrontation at Christmas Eve of 2023, which involves Sandie Peggie saying to Dr. Upton that Dr. Upton is not allowed to be in this space because he is a man. And that then launches an investigation into Sandie Peggie for a series of forms of misconduct. And she is taking both NHS Fife and Dr. Upton to this tribunal to challenge the lawfulness of that. Her argument is that this is unlawful discrimination and harassment against her.
So just to stay with the beginning of this, did the NHS organisation have rules around the use of changing rooms? What were the rules regarding Beth Upton's use of the female changing rooms?
So it's actually unclear whether there were specific policies in place at the time that Dr. Upton began to work at NHS Fife. We're hearing about that as the tribunal goes on. But we do know from evidence over the last few days is that Upton was told by equality and diversity managers who then kind of fed that back into the system that Upton did have a right to use those spaces.
Yeah, because I suppose what I'm getting at has the tribunal become to be about the relative rights of women and trans women, who has the greater right, or about the more narrow question of Peggie's behaviour to Upton?
Well, it has to deal with both of those things. I mean, a central part of this question, or the question that's before the tribunal, is whether or not the presence of Dr. Upton in that changing room is lawful or unlawful, whether it amounts to unlawful harassment of Nurse Peggie, or whether it is a lawful use or exercise of a right that Dr. Upton has. And so central to the legal submissions that will be submitted here is whether in law Dr. Upton actually had an entitlement to use that space.
And the tribunal, the reports that I've seen, there's been an awful lot of time and an awful gulf exposed between the words used by both parties and what the words mean.
Yes, that's absolutely right. I mean, the parties have had a preliminary hearing to address the specific issue about language that's going to be used. Nurse Peggie's legal team have said that they don't want to put any restrictions on the language that's being used by anybody in the tribunal. They want the right to be able to bring the case that they think is the strongest case here. And they say it's impossible for them to explain why Nurse Peggie was harassed in this context without stating that Dr. Upton is a man. In response to that, Dr. Upton and NHS Fife's counsel have argued that it would be unlawful harassment and a human rights violation for anybody in the tribunal not to use Dr. Upton's preferred pronouns. And the tribunal has ruled that parties are free to use the language that's appropriate in their case, but that it cannot be gratuitous. So the tribunal has reserved an entitlement to step in if things cross a line that the judge decides. But we haven't had anything to that effect so far yet.
Is it likely, Michael, it's hard to see into the future, that the result of this tribunal will have a wider ramifications for the way the NHS deals with these issues?
But I think it's going to have to be. I mean, just to kind of set this situation in terms of the legal framework that we have here, there is a very, very clear law that requires employers, the employment workplace context, to provide separate changing facilities for employees, so separate changing facilities for men and women. And we know that legally, if there isn't a gender recognition certificate, trans women are legally considered to be men, and trans men are legally considered to be women. And it's up in the air at the moment whether or not a gender recognition certificate will be relevant for determining that. But we know in this case that Dr. Upton couldn't possibly have had a gender recognition certificate at the time that these events occurred, based on evidence that Upton has given in terms of the timeline where transition will have started and the requirements for a 2-year requirement to have lived in the acquired gender before a gender recognition certificate can be obtained. So as a matter of law, my view is that Dr. Upton had no legal entitlement to be in those spaces. And that is law that is relatively clear. It's just not been applied. And it's unclear as to whether or not that is an issue that is peculiar to NHS Fife, or whether this applies across the board throughout the NHS, or even in a wider context of other workplaces.
Just briefly.
So we're kind of waiting for this disconnect between the law and what's happening in practice to be resolved.
Just briefly, Michael, when do we expect a verdict?
It's incredibly unclear at this point, unfortunately, because of significant and persistent failures of disclosure on NHS Fife and Dr. Upton's part. The tribunal have lost a day and a half of time over what was supposed to be a 10-day period, which means they have to adjourn on Friday and continue to hear this case at a later date, which cannot be fixed at this point. So we may be looking at sometime into the summer or even the autumn before this tribunal is finished hearing the evidence and the arguments, and then a further time to wait for a decision that will come from the tribunal itself. So we can't expect anything in the next few weeks or months, I'd say.
A while to wait then. Thank you very much, Michael Foran, law lecturer at the University of Glasgow.